Top tip number 4, open your aperture. Now that we're a little bit more familiar with ISO and shutter speed settings, the third part of the exposure triangle is your aperture setting. Now, the aperture is a mechanical device inside the lens that controls how much light comes in and affects the sensor for a well-exposed image. This must be balanced with the ISO and the shutter speed. If your aperture is open very wide, it's going to let a lot of light come into the camera. If your aperture is a very narrow setting, a very small hole, then not much light will come in and affect the sensor. So these three things must work together in balance to create a well-exposed image. The aperture in a camera lens is very similar to the iris in our eye in the way it controls the amount of light coming in and affecting the image. Aperture settings are measured in f-stops, and this is a standard photographic measurement based on the focal length of the lens. A standard kit zoom lens that comes with a DSLR camera will often have a widest aperture setting of say f4 or f5.6, whereas a fixed lens, say a 50mm, can have an aperture that will open up as wide as f1.8 or 1.4 and let a lot more light into the camera. The other effect that the aperture setting has is the amount of the image which is in focus. If you're photographing and your aperture is closed down to say f16 or f22, so a very small aperture, a lot of the image will be in focus. Whereas if you're shooting with a aperture setting of say f2.8 or 1.4, you're only going to have a very small amount of the image in focus. This is known as the depth of field, how much of the image is in focus. And you can choose to be very creative with this. I love shooting with lenses with an f-stop of 1.4 because it allows me to really isolate my subject from a background. As I mentioned earlier, and as we've talked a lot about the exposure triangle, you must balance these settings. If you're choosing a very wide aperture setting, you're going to need to choose a faster shutter speed and a lower ISO, of course depending on your lighting conditions. If you're photographing outside on a bright sunny day, it's going to be more difficult to use a wide aperture because of the amount of light that there is. But balancing your shutter speed and ISO with your wide aperture, you can still get a well-exposed image. Again, take your camera out, shoot a series of images of the same subject with the widest aperture setting, with a medium aperture setting, and then a very small aperture setting, remembering that the lower the number, the wider the aperture. So 1.4 is very, very wide, f22, f32, the aperture is very, very narrow. And so bring those images back to your computer and then compare them side by side. Be careful also when you're shooting them to make sure that you focus on the same point of the image so that you can really get an understanding about depth of field and how your aperture setting affects this. If you are shooting with a standard kit lens with the widest aperture being say f4 or 5.6, the effect of depth of field is not going to be so dramatic as if you're shooting with a lens that can open up its aperture say to f2.8 or f1.4. It is good to experiment with photographing the same subject using different aperture settings so you can see that you can be more creative with your camera.